In this episode of Savannah, Georgia, Anything But Ordinary.
And so quite oftentimes people will buy a home, things start to happen in their house, and then they realize something happened on this land. Would you want to live there? Would you want to live on top of land where there are people who are laid to rest underneath?
Hey y'all, I'm Shannon. Thanks for tuning in to Savannah, Georgia, Anything But Ordinary. In this week's episode, we sat down with T.C. Michaels of Genteel and Bard to talk about Savannah's dark side. History, murder, death, and disease have all contributed to Savannah's notoriety as one of the world's most haunted cities. But did you know that mysterious events are still happening today? Take a listen.
So I'm T.C. Michaels, and I am co-owner of Genteel and Bard, in which we are public historians, my wife Brennan and I, and we also host tours to guests who come to Savannah. People ask me, so what's a great story? Like if I was writing a great story about Savannah, a great haunted ghost story, I immediately would tell them Alice Riley, Richard White, and the early Irish who came to Savannah. It has everything. And that particular story began as them just being indentured servants on a ship. And they're supposed to go to New England. That's where they're supposed to go, not coming to here. But it's a small little wooden ship, and they hit this perfect storm where suddenly, I could not imagine being on that ship. People who you know are getting to know along a 7-week voyage, and next thing you know, they're thrown overboard, they're dead in the icy waters. And food being thrown overboard. Next thing you're starving, you're holding on to your lives. And the captain decided to come south. So January 10th, 1734, James Oglethorpe, he notices a ship coming up the river, and there's only 6 women and 34 men who survived this voyage. And there were dead people on the ship as well. Mm-hmm. And so that's how the Irish community began in Savannah, because he then offered to purchase their contracts from all the families up north who had their contracts. And so he then issued them here as indentured servants throughout. But the thing is that they were alive, and they had a place to possibly establish a home. So Alice and Richard, the gentleman who bought their contract, was a man named William Wise, who lived across on Hutchinson Island, who was not a well-liked man at the time. There's accounts of him being just incredibly abrasive individual, not a kind individual. So people said, go live across the river. Mm-hmm. So he lived on Hutchinson Island. But now you gotta think they're away from everything they've ever known. They're in this new world. This gentleman now owns their contract, and they have to tend his land. They're isolated over in Hutchinson Island. And uncovering the history is fascinating about this is because James Oglethorpe wasn't here. He was over in England on a trip when Alice Riley and Richard White, they did decide to kill William Wise. Now, there's many different theories of why they would kill him. Now, perhaps he was known to be such an angry individual to beat them and to abuse them. And so there is a fascinating letter that still exists to where you kind of piece the history of it, which was James Oglethorpe gave power to those who lived here while he was gone. And so the accounts that we have of those people who are living here, now granted, there's people who never governed themselves for the first time. There's people trying to establish a new way of life, and they're now in charge. They have a decision to make. And so according to this interesting letter that is recorded in the records, is that they killed William Wise, possibly out of desperation, now winning that lifestyle, living it again. And so they're isolated over there being beaten. And so they dumped the body in the river. Richard White, he quickly ran into South Carolina. Alice Riley, she ran south. Now, to top us all off, Catholics were banned from Georgia and South Carolina at the time because of the war that they were having against the Spanish in Florida. So now you have 2 Catholics banned originally. James Oglethorpe took pity upon them because they're Irish Catholic. And so now you have 2 Catholics at the time who are on the run, in which the culture was, if they're found, they're going to assume they're Spanish. And so it was an interesting thing. And so they were caught, and Richard White, no mercy at all, immediately took him over to where Wright Square stands today, which is where they did hang him. And so now he's dead. But Alice Riley became fascinating, where the story becomes really intriguing, because Alice Riley, right before they were about to hang her, take her out to the square, she revealed to them that she was pregnant.
Oh boy.
And actually, the stakes are higher. Yeah. So put you in the eyes of those who are in charge, and you now are upon a woman who is presented to you that she's pregnant. Would you believe her? Would you not believe her? Is this all part of her master plan in order to escape? And so they decided to wait. And so they decided to wait to see if she was telling the truth. And in fact, she was telling the truth. So she was pregnant. Now, to this day, we don't know whether it was William Wise's child. We don't know if it was Richard White's child. However, the thing was that she was pregnant. And so they decided to wait. So you look at the timeline of events, is that 1734 is when Richard White was hung. And so December comes around in 1734, Alice went into labor. And when she went into labor at the time, think of her, all of this is built up. All is built up in her, and her child is growing within for these months. And in her mind, I cannot imagine whether she was thinking, I'm going to be hung in that square. Or one time, I'm going to die with that rope around my neck. And when she had her child, they wrapped the child up, took the child out of the room, and did inform her, you will not be seeing your child's face. Now, there's many different theories of what that could have possibly been. For one, would they not want her to see the child just because they want her to have that emotional upon her knowing that her fate was going to be hung and she's going to be sentenced because she was a murderer? So they waited till January 19th, a month later. She was hung. And the fascinating thing is in the letter, it states that her child's name was James. And then all you read in the letter is the child expired 45 days into life. That's scary. I mean, think about today's context. I mean, that's incredible things that were taking place at that time. And so when you take places of that connected with paranormal activity of today, is you got to look at those places where there is a concentration of death. And then you think about the souls and being stripped away from their bodies. And there's places where Savannah it's like that, whether it is battlefields like the Siege of Savannah, or is it like the hangings in the Wright Square. And when it comes to that, you take that and tie this history, is that you notice a lot of it has to do with the land. A lot of it's with the land in our city. And so that adds another interesting aspect about Savannah. As I do tell our guests, I say, there's many things that happen inside of homes. There's a lot of tragedy that happens inside of homes, and we're going to share those stories with you. But I want you to really keep an essence of the land of Savannah that is so significant as well, where many people don't even realize, people say, what is the initial thing that separates Savannah from many other cities? I said, well, if you were in a place like Charleston, which is an incredibly beautiful city, what you'd be seeing about every 4 or 5 blocks or so is one of the most beautiful churches you've ever seen. And there's stunning, stunning churches. And you notice right next to the church is a graveyard. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a difference. Graveyards are next to churches. Cemeteries are separate on their own plot of land. And I always tell them, so think right now of your dream home. And think about everything you ever wanted in that dream house. Everything you've ever thought of that you want in that home. And your home sits, dream house is going to be right next to a church, right next to a graveyard in Charleston. And everyone knows that a lot of those graveyards go underneath the houses surrounding it. Would you want to buy that house? Then I expand it with Savannah. I go, well, Savannah, we did not know where the cemeteries were. They were discovered over time while discovering our history and our past. We don't have graveyards here. We just have cemeteries. And so quite oftentimes people will buy a home, things start to happen in their house, and then they realize something happened on this land. And so there are blocks of our city where there are still remains of the deceased. And then you see a beautiful home, you see a block of houses, like, would you want to live there? Would you want to live on top of land where there are people who are laid to rest underneath? And it's interesting who you talk to, because some people say, oh, it doesn't bother me, they're dead. And the other people say, no, not really. It kind of makes me uncomfortable just a little bit. Just kind of know, that they're there. Yeah. And so we will share, the first cemetery, Savannah, is right there over near Wright Square. And so it's right where you have the corner of Bull Street and York Street is where you have it. And it extends all the way from York Street going down to Oglethorpe Avenue. And so you have a big block where today you don't even realize it. Mm. And so it starts to get in your mindset a little bit. And it becomes really interesting, it becomes fascinating of why did the city do it? Why would it be like that? Well, at one time it was just different culture. That's it. Mm-hmm. It was a different culture of times where if they had a project and they needed some land or something, that there was no underground plumbing at that time. So just go ahead and just build right on top.
Yeah, it's definitely known as a city built on its dead.
Yeah, that's what we're called. We're called the city built on its dead. Exactly. Mm-hmm. I mean, so for you, would you live in a haunted house? If you knew the place was haunted and you knew that it had a reputation for being haunted, would you want to buy that house?
I probably would. I think I've lived here long enough now. It's part of the mystique a little bit. And I think as a person that I always believe the best in people that are alive. I think I believe that of those that aren't alive too. So I would just hope they were friendly.
You would hope that it would be friendly.
Yeah.
Yes, and you hope they were friendly, but then we have friends of ours who bought houses in the historic district. And so one of our friends said that there was a cross in the house when they bought the house. And it was over in Huntington is where they live, Huntington Drive by Forsyth Park. And she says it was a mysterious cross. And so my daughter was so intrigued by it that she said, oh, look, there's a cross. But the strange thing, though, is she'd leave the cross in one place, and then they'd leave, they come back, the cross would be in a different location of the house. And then she would tell me, she goes, and then one night I come down the stairs, my husband's on the couch, he's asleep. My daughter's upstairs sleeping. I come into the parlor room and I sit down, and next thing you know, I hear somebody coming down the steps. And he's snoring. My daughter's upstairs, and she goes, I call the people who we bought the house from, and they go, oh, it's haunted. And they go, why didn't you tell us? And the previous seller said, you never asked. So think about even buying a house in Savannah today, where will you be the one to go see a house and go, so can you tell us if this house is haunted or not?
Yeah.
You know, what are the things that have happened in this home? And my wife and I, we live in a 150-year-old house. And so we researched the history of the home because we know exactly what took place in our house. And so it gets into your mind. It really does. You know, just the history. But if you take it to that mystery, it's fascinating to discuss with people who are interested in paranormal, who are interested in ghost stories. I mean, even for you, when you think of ghost stories, what interests you in them?
Is it true or not?
Exactly.
I want to know. If you're
Exactly.
a skeptic, if you're someone that's never had your own experience.
And there's so many different theories of what paranormal activity is. And from my studies, have been narrowed down basically to 4 different theories, which is many people who get relatives who come to visit them to make sure that they're safe, make sure they're sound. Another theory by scientists that's all simply just energy. And it's our imagination playing with our minds. And so when you capture something on a ghost detecting equipment, you're really just capturing that energy. I always find it fascinating with the dimensions. There's 11 dimensions in science. Only 3 have been proven true: height, length, width. The 4th dimension is time, and that's still considered a theory. But the 5th and 6th dimensions becomes fascinating because in those dimensions in science, there's 2 worlds traveling along a common line, side by side. And so per se, those 2 worlds crisscross in their paths. Well, will we get a glimpse of that dimension? Will they get a glimpse of ours? Mm-hmm. And so that's a fascinating little theory when it comes to it. So some people claim that they see a ghost or something and the ghost suddenly disappears. Well, if it was science, if it's true, then it could be some different dimension. But the number one most believed theory, though, is something that really puts people on edge more than all the others. And you look at all the horror movies that are all done, it is evil. Mm-hmm. It is the devil. It's God. Mm-hmm. It's light. It's dark. Angels, demons. And I think that's where the mindset of the fear comes, is with that. So often people will ask us if anybody's ever been physically hurt. Physical things. And when it comes to the stories of Savannah, we get the most activity near the Sorel weed house. That's where I've always encountered the most activity with my guests, is around that home. And the home was built and completed in 1840 by Francis Sorel. But I will tell my guests upon we go into the house, I say, for the men, just be aware. I've had guests who felt pain. I've felt pain in their chest, pain in their back area. I've had guests who've been scratched around here, burn sensations around here, nauseousness. And it happened the other night. Where one of my guests, she comes up to me, she goes, I'm quite uncomfortable. I'm getting this chest pain right now. And so in front of everybody I said, okay, we're going to try something. I want you to go right across the street over to that light. It's going to go away immediately. She goes across the street. Not even a minute later, I see her and her husband coming back to us, says, how do you feel? She goes, didn't even get close to the light, and it went away. And then the same night, different girls, same thing. She got pain up and down her arms. And they said, when we leave the property, you're going to feel better. You know, and so the thing that's interesting to me is the consistencies of the hauntings that do happen to people, because they are consistent in what actually happens to them at the locations. And then you try to find the history and try to tag it. And the Sorel Weed House, in fact, is right there near Madison Square, where part of the siege of Savannah did take place on October 9th. Now, psychologists say that if you want to manifest something in your mind, if you want to see it, you'll see it. If you want to feel it, you'll feel it. And so that association. And so when you come into the city, if it's already preset in your mind that this is an incredibly haunted city, and then you start learning about the history and it becomes real, well, that's going to do something to your mind as well. But we always do share with our guests as well, so we talk about a lot of this history. We talk about some amazing things about Savannah and the ghostly stories like Wright Square, or even down by the river, or Sorel Weed House, or battlefields. Even in the homes, we share that these houses endured so much hardship and death through yellow fever in our city. And it becomes so meaty in your house. Yellow fever, the first epidemic was 1820 when a fire did break out. And because of the remnants of the fire in wintertime, they couldn't rebuild the city fast enough. So when summertime came around in 1820, you had homeless families in the squares. And then because of the heat and the rain, well, then you have the mosquitoes that come up. And then you have the animal waste. And then you have the combination to where yellow fever became rampant. Well, in our particular city, that we did have outbreaks in 1854, 1876. And so now you're starting to connect the dots a little bit. There's a lot that's happened in Savannah. And when you take something like yellow fever, where they were quarantining individuals and family members in their homes, because obviously they didn't want the city to be spread upon the streets, and they did not know that it was mosquitoes. In 1876, there was a doctor in which you're reading his medical journal. In his medical journal, it stated, for some reason, we cannot figure out that it's worst at sunset. That's when the mosquitoes come out. That's when we have the no-see-ums. And they couldn't connect it. And so when you take that, and you now own a home, and you realize how many people, what was the tragic number of people who died even from yellow fever inside my house? And then you think of the stories of those families, and you cover those families, and you're like, wow, it's such history that took place in our home. And then you have all these different little things that happen in history, and then I share with my guests about, what about right now? What about right now in our city of what could be taking place? And then I'll share about the incredible and rich culture of the Hoodoo, H-U-D-U. And Hoodoo is incredibly fascinating. It really is. Not voodoo, but Hoodoo. And so Voodoo is considered the mother church of both voodoo and hoodoo. And so Hoodoo's been in these parts for many, many years. I mean, over hundreds of years. And the belief of the root doctors in Hoodoo is the belief that they have the ability to conjure spirits, to either do good or evil, most of the times for healing, and with the rituals of their particular religion. So when you come about the faith and about religion, well, now you have Hoodoo, where they will go ahead and they will conjure spirits to then do things, do services, whether it's healing and everything. And so it's fascinating of cultures around these part of around Savannah as well. And it's all still the storytelling of the city. It's all right now as well. I always tell people, so when you think about history, the amazing thing about history is it's constantly being written. Nonstop, all day long, history's being written. And your story's being written. So where is your connectivity of your story with the history? And when people start to combine those things and relate, that's when it becomes emotional. That's when you're affected, even if it's something of a joyous history or something that's haunting. There's something you said that, one of my fondest things is I was curious, to have those times of what it would have been like if all we did have today was still just the gas lamps. And it became nighttime. And you think at one time, the way people were led themselves through the city at nighttime was that the person in front would have the main light and you would follow the light. Most likely that was a person who had been a servant to the family. And so I think when you walk around Savannah at nighttime, you think of that time, it's a mystical, it's an eerie thing, but it's also, there's a romance behind that. There's a beauty behind that. I do share with my guests, as said, as locals, we feel like we live in a storybook every day. There's no other city like Savannah. There is none. I guarantee you there's no other city in the entire United States. When you enter, you have this immediate first impression like you're entering an incredible story. Just by looking around and seeing the squares and the Spanish moss and the beautiful homes. And you start listening. I always start listen to Savannah. Sit down in a square and you'll hear a musicality of the footsteps of the horses and carriages, the conversation. So if you want to go to one city where locals have so much pride that you can sit down in the square and we're sharing a story about our city to somebody. I even tell people, it says, if you're going to ask directions, just be prepared. After you ask directions of where to go, someone from a local, they're going to share you a story about what took place and where you're going. And we have so much pride in it and beauty because it is like a storybook. But at nighttime, it changes. The story changes at nighttime where it becomes this, do you want to walk that way? no, there's a feeling that way. There's something eerie about going that way. And it becomes even more intriguing to dive into what those stories are.
Yeah. We talked a little bit earlier about one of the squares, which I'd like to touch on, especially now that we're talking about After Dark. I know for me personally, I've always heard a lot of different stories about Calhoun Square. And I have to say, it's one of those that it makes me a little nervous to be in it after dark, and I don't know why. Calhoun
Square, which is heading towards the southeast of the historic district, is fascinating because it's very, very hidden. It's where the Massey Institute is, which is a fantastic place to go to dive into Savannah's history. And so you'll hear many stories around that particular square, especially surrounding one particular home on that square. You start diving into the history of it. And that's when it becomes more real in your mind. And like I said earlier, where does fear come from? Like, where do you think fear comes from?
The unknown.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, so fear comes from the unknown, and fear comes from not knowing with the possibility of being hurt some way, something negative happening. And it's that fear of the unknown. And so you just kind of start connecting it with history and the stories and going, wow, okay. We've hosted people who have been scratched, hosted people who feel something, physical reaction to something. And you start looking at history, seeing if there's any common place to it. And that's where the fear becomes fascinating and a little bit more real when it comes to that and the paranormal activity. I'll never forget this. We were speaking to a wonderful, wonderful woman who used to own a local hotel. And she says that when I bought the hotel, the previous owner gave me a trunk of letters. It was a big, huge trunk of letters. And the previous owner said, read all these letters. And she goes, what do you mean? She goes, just do it. Read all the letters. I'm not going to tell you anything. You'll figure it out. And she goes, so I go home, I take the trunk, and my husband and I sit down, and I open up, and I start reading the list. She goes, I just bought this hotel. And she goes, I'm going through the letters. And every single letter told of an encounter of a little girl by the guests of the hotel. And she goes, so it's interesting, all the letters said the exact same thing. She goes, but it became very, very haunting and apparent, though. Every single letter had completely different dates and different years on the handwritten letters. And she goes, chills come down my spine of realizing we just bought this hotel and we had no idea that this was taking place of so long of an encounter with a little girl. And so then you think of that you own a hotel, you have guests who come to you and strange things are happening inside of their rooms. And so what did you encounter? And they said, I don't know why, but I woke up and something was brushing my hair, open my eyes. There was a little girl standing there. What do you say to your guests? I'm sorry? Would you like another room? And she goes, it just became so real at that moment of the history. And now today of people having these encounters. And that's when it becomes very fascinating, is that consistency of the dots starting to connect.
Right.
And Savannah has it.
Yeah.
We just have it.
It definitely has that allure, the juxtaposition of, like, when you walk around at night, it's a little bit romantic, but it's also a little bit frightening. And you're kind of stuck in that limbo of, I'm enticed by this, but I'm also a little bit scared.
And I think you just nailed it. It was great. We're so enticed. We're so enticed to unlock that mystery of what does happen to us after we die. And people have their sound beliefs. I have my own personal sound beliefs and, of truth in my heart of what it is. And everyone has their own. And I always tell people, it doesn't matter where you come from, doesn't matter what your beliefs are, all well respected by me. And it said, just look into your own lives and look at your beliefs. And we're enticed by this. We're enticed by this question of what happens to us. And people come to Savannah to try to discover the answer. One great story that I absolutely love. I love one of these stories is Patrick on 1790 Inn, which many people go by 1700. Because he was sharing with my wife and I, he goes, one of my favorite stories is this. He says, there's a wonderful couple who are a retired couple. And they want to stay in the famous room 204. Or everyone wants to stay in 204 at 1790 Inn. And he says the gentleman was a military member. And so he was very, very disciplined and everything. And so every night, he would match his socks to the suit he was going to wear the next day. And he put the socks in his shoes. And so they stay the night in 1700, and he wakes up, and the socks are not in his shoes. And he goes to his wife, so do you know where my socks are? She goes, I'm not going to move your socks. I know you. She goes, I'm not going to do that. And he goes, well, I can't find my socks. And she goes, well, we're just going to go get breakfast downstairs. Don't worry about it. We'll get you some socks. I'm hungry. Let's go get some breakfast. They go downstairs. They meet with their friends or have breakfast. And so then afterwards, they come back to the room. And it was a little chill in the air. And he's still getting ready. And she goes, well, I'm getting a little chilly, so I'm going to go grab a blanket. She goes over to the wardrobe. She opens it up. And on the top shelf was a blanket. She pulls the blanket out, and 2 socks pop out on her head from the top shelf of the wardrobe. She gets scared. She goes, here's your socks. And Patrick says that when they shared the story with him, he goes, I just wish that they had like their camera rolling or something to see if these 2 socks actually floated to go into there. And they were on edge for the rest of the time.
Oh, yeah.
That they were staying there.
Yeah, tons of great stories out of the 90 there.
Yeah.
And room 204 is, you hear all kinds of things about, is that the one with the woman in black too, or? Yeah,
1790 is interesting when we talk about the history. And that's one thing where the telephone game came into play, where a lot of different, through the time and ages, the stories would change over that. The place was actually built in several different time periods and different years of additions, basically because of the growing of families who lived inside of that house. And so you will hear stories about that. With that particular place, it's fascinating just because of what does happen to people in the hotel and in the inn, and of stories of waking up and seeing just an apparition hovering over you. And then, of course, the story of the little boy, Thaddeus, Patrick calls Thaddeus, who will leave coins for people. And even Patrick was sharing me one time, says there's another little boy who will leave coins in random places. And he said that one time he was hosting a meeting for the staff, and he was having some fun with it. And he said, Thaddeus, you only leave pennies. Why is it only pennies that you're leaving all the time? If you're going to do something, let's leave it something a little bit more than just pennies. And he said after the meeting, he comes around the corner, and there was 2 quarters sitting on the mirror. And he just said, my jaw just dropped. I said, there's 2 quarters that weren't there when we started the meeting. And he's just like, okay, all right, Thaddeus, I got it, buddy. And so, it's those little occurrences that gets in your mind. So now you think about that, and you think about psychology, and you think about now, if something happens to you, every time you go into that room, you're going to be thinking about it. You will be thinking about it from that date forward. That's what is fascinating about being a local in the historic homes. Because when something does happen and you can't explain it, and it becomes mysterious to you, then every time you go into that room, just by habit, you're going to start thinking about it. And it's going to grow in you. And then something else happens, it's going to grow in you. The first apartment that we ever lived in Savannah, one of the scariest places I've ever lived in. The scariest place. Brenna, she calls me one day, she goes, I am not going back in until you come home.
Wow.
I'm not going back into that place. And we lived on the corner of Liberty Street and Abercorn Street, right near the cathedral. And so, did you live in it? Yeah. And so she calls me one day and she says, so I was about to walk the dog, and I come down the stairs and I hear just above me this doom, 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 doom. And she goes, I hear the noises. There's someone following. She goes, I turn around to say hi to our neighbor. Nobody comes. She goes, so I go down the next flight of stairs and I hear the same thing above me, this doom, 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 doom. She says, I turn around, nobody's there. She goes, so I took upon myself to go all the way up to the top floor of the entire building. I start knocking on doors, and I realize that I'm the only one in the entire building. She goes, I'm not going back in there until you come home. And so from that date forward, it was in her mind. Is her mindset that she couldn't explain something happened of paranormal activity, and she just couldn't explain it, so it was in her mind. And then it got in my mind where people think I'm crazy, they think I'm nuts, and I said, no, this happened in our apartment, the exact same apartment. I rarely share this story because of how crazy it seems, and my wife was right there, like you talked, it was right there, is that she was in the front of the apartment one night, and she's on the phone with her mother, and I'm in the bathroom, and I'm brushing my teeth. And so the bathroom was right adjacent to the bedroom, where the bathroom door was open. You see the entire bedroom. And mind you, it was 650 square feet. It was a whole apartment, real small apartment. And so I'm brushing my teeth and I'm looking in the mirror, and as I'm brushing the teeth, y'all, behind me, I see a whole roll of toilet paper fly, graze the back of my head, hit the wall, fell at my feet. And I'm sitting there going, whoa, wait, whoa. And it's like, wait. In my mind, I'm going, that just happened. It just happened. And here's becoming really freaky as I started feeling these strange things. My mind's working itself. I take the toilet paper and I put it back where it's supposed to be and put it on the other side of the room. Put it on its end. I come out, Brenna's looking at me, and realizing what happened to her is I said, I have to show you something. We come around the corner to go back into the bathroom, and I said, well, I put the toilet paper back. It was once again on the other side of the room. It was sitting on the floor on its end, and the toilet paper was folded over the sides neatly. Like something had to intentionally place it. I looked at her, and with lip sync, I went, let's get out of here. And we left. So we started just being so aware of this that we were just uncomfortable. We're just uncomfortable yet intrigued to try to unlock the history of what took place. And so from that moment on is when we really became fascinated with the history of Savannah, to dive even further, dive in further into the stories to unlock it. And it's intriguing.
Yeah. I have chills just
would you?
I'm afraid to go home.
I will give you the address, and you can go stay there because you can go stay there if you want to. Now, when you think of that, now you think of that, would you stay there?
I would, but it's funny how we were talking about earlier. Like we see these houses, these historic homes, and as locals, we know the people who live there and things like that. I'm thinking that address. Like my best friend lives around the corner. I used to live down there. I know a ton of other people, and it just makes you think. If everyone out there who was experiencing things documented it or were telling their stories and things like that, how many more current things we would be hearing from everyone. I mean, it's crazy to think about.
Yeah, and whenever I have locals who do join me, say on one of our night tours, and I love it when I have locals who join me. I love it because I love them sharing their stories. And when I'm sort of sharing little initial things about how there are stores here that sell sage, stores that sell holy water, all that type of things, they're nodding up and down. And I say, have you been in there? They go, oh, we go in there once a month. We all the time we're inside of there. You just become used to it. And people go, you're nuts. And we go, well, it's Savannah. Look how beautiful it is, and strange things happen. And so people do things that make them comfortable in their own homes, whatever it is, whatever it may be. And so it's like what you said, if people came out and just kind of shared their stories, and that's the thing is people are like, I don't want to be, am I going to be judged? Am I this or that? Yeah. And what it really comes down to is just kind of saying, I can't explain it, but I've seen it, I've felt it, and so be it. Mm-hmm. And then you're intrigued to dive into the history. Brenna and I with Genteel and Bard, we just love sharing it. And so we do invite anyone who wants to come join us and during our morning history walk or our evening ghost walk and diving into the different types of history of the city. It's always fun. And so we do invite y'all. Just, we love engagement. We love talking. So please come right to us, genteelandbard.com, and follow us on Instagram, which is Genteel and Bard Savannah. And so we really just love having that camaraderie and passion. And we even tell you the haunted places to go hang out at as well if you want to have a nice dinner, but we'll say, but don't use the restroom. Use the restroom beforehand and don't use the restroom because something's going to happen to you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Savannah, Georgia, Anything But Ordinary. This podcast has been brought to you by Visit Savannah, the official destination marketing organization for Savannah, Georgia, and the surrounding area, produced by Tyler Edick and hosted by Shannon Lowry. Make sure you subscribe to us on your favorite listening platform, follow us on social media at Visit Savannah, and learn more at visitsavannah.com.